Social responsibility at the University of Manchester, and a co-lead, as I said, of the Institution and Government theme. He's an expert in local regional economic development, higher education, science policy, and has worked extensively across the UK government as a political and special advisor. Andy, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure so far.
Yeah, so far. It will be a good conversation for the next half hour, because we're going to talk about an exciting piece of work. Indeed, as I said, titled Leveling Up Local Growth and Productivity, and we'll talk about all three of those. This is a paper we'll release right after this live stream. So if you go to our website, productivity.ac.uk, in about an hour from now, you can find the paper and some other materials related to this. Now, of course, obviously the timing of this is good, because we are looking, or at least anticipating, that the government will come up with a leveling up white paper in the next couple of days. And this paper really talks about how do we need to think about leveling up more from an organizational, from an institutional point of view? How do we optimally devolve powers, and also know how not to do it, because some of the devolutions did not quite work the way out that they perhaps should. And also, what are the biggest levers here to make productivity and rising living standards really happen in a sort of regional and local context? So let's dive in right away, Andy. And I think the first question that everybody always asks me when we talk about leveling up is, what the heck is it? I think the government has some sort of a definition. Maybe you can tell us what that definition is, and maybe you can tell us also whether you agree with that definition.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bart. I mean, it's a slogan that's been around for a while without a definition. So that's the first thing to say. We've all been guilty of using it whilst we wait for a definition. But I think, as you say, with the white paper kind of expected in the next kind of week or two, certainly this side of Christmas, you know, we're beginning to see much more kind of flesh on the bones, if you like. And I think we know more or less how that white paper is going to be structured, and that's basically according to the government's definition of levelling up, as you say. And the kind of person I go to for that definition is Neil O'Brien, who is now a minister at the Department for Levelling Up. The Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which we can shorten to Deluxe, apparently.
Nice abbreviation in the mix here.
In case you needed to know that. And Neil, who was working on the white paper before the department was formed, and before Michael Gove and Andy Haldane joined him at the department. So he's a real kind of long-term player on this agenda. And so he defined it during the Conservative Party conference, which was held here in Manchester, in the following 4 ways. First, which is probably one of the areas we're most interested in, to grow the private sector and raise living standards, particularly where they are lower. Yeah. As you say, you know, lots of inequality at regional and local levels. So that's a clear heading. The second, around the model, is to empower local leaders and communities. So there, you know, you've got kind of a hint about how devolution might work and kind of what the priorities within new structures might be. The third is to spread opportunity and improve public services, again, particularly where they are lacking. And the fourth one, which has become kind of, I think, you know, perhaps the most totemic, is to restore local pride, to generate a sense of civic pride in the place that you're from. And again, you know, Neil O'Brien didn't add this, but I would on his behalf, especially where that's been lacking.
Wow, but that's just like a heck of a broad definition, right?
Yeah.
But do you think this is a good starting point, or do you think
I
we need
do
to
actually
narrow this down a little bit to get actionable?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of, in terms of how you deliver those things, you need to start narrowing them down and thinking about what are the interventions, what are the particular policy initiatives, as well as the institutions and kind of funding pots that are going to kind of really deliver change in any one of those four things. And it's an incredibly complex thing to do. And the one thing governments typically do badly is join up across all of those ideas and services. So it is a big job. And of course, it's a very big job because those inequalities that we talk about are so deep and so long standing.
Yeah. So your paper really puts a lot of emphasis then on productivity. That's why we're sitting here as Productivity Inst, and on spatial disparities. You link these two things. Yeah, how are they connected as part of this debate?
Well, I think we would certainly agree, wouldn't we, that kind of unless you do something about productivity and economic growth, so many of those other things get much harder, if not impossible.
Because the money isn't there, or
because the money isn't there, because people don't feel the way that they might about the place that they're in. The investment kind of propositions become less obvious. The opportunities to tap into different public services to get new skills or to get business support aren't there, and you end up in a kind of a negative spiral going downwards rather than an upward spiral kind of going in the right direction. So I think it is incredibly difficult to do, and of course the white paper, we will pull it apart when it arrives, and we will look at the individual measures that government is proposing in each of those subject headings. But I think it is worth saying, actually, as a set of headings, they're not bad. I think there's a lot of kind of concern about what civic pride is and how you shift it, but we shouldn't deny that it's important. And someone like Andy Haldane, who we know well, he's an honorary professor here at the business school. He's written a lot before he took on the kind of current role he has in levelling up in the Cabinet Office. He wrote a lot about the importance of the social fabric and social capital to productivity and economic development. So so I think that matters a great deal, and how government define that and how they fund it will matter a great deal. But probably most importantly will be how they balance all of those things.
Yeah, because if you unpack this a little bit and you think about some of the specific policies that are in this leveling up agenda related to productivity issues, you think about regional policy, you think about industrial strategy, you think about education, vocational education in particular. And those are the three that actually we're really struggling with a bit in the UK, and especially in England, don't we?
And we've struggled with it for a very long time, all three of them. In fact, the Institute for Government wrote a very, very good report in 2017 called All Change, and they picked out each one of those areas as the areas that demonstrate most policy churn in Britain. So we find it very hard not just to develop policy, but to stick to them in each of those areas, whether it's industrial strategy, regional policy, or skills. Yeah,
so a couple of words I was going to ask you about this. So why is it that we're not in a good place here in the UK? And a couple of words that come back in your report all the time. One is fragmentation, the other one is lack of coordination, and the third one is short-termism. Talk us a little bit around it. How did we end up in this place that we keep struggling for about 30 years, getting our arms around these issues?
Well, 30 years is right. I mean, first of all, it's this is a long time frame. I think a lot of criticism is offered at many governments, not just the UK's or England's, about the inability to kind of coordinate things across policies and initiatives across different government departments, different silos of activity. So coordinating things, for example, spending R&D money where you also spend money to enhance the skills of the population. It's hard to get both departments to do that at the same time. It's also very hard for different reasons to stick to a kind of consistent long-term approach to either regional policy or industrial policy. The idea goes in and out of favour. We chop and change the institutions, and it's maybe in those two areas as well as in skills and vocational education that that we see this constant chopping and changing things. And I mean, in skills in particular, the amount of change to policy is phenomenal. I worked in skills in government, so I was probably responsible for some of it, so for which I should apologise. But since as I say in the report, since 1992, and the kind of, there was a Further and Higher Education Act under that Conservative government. But since then, for the kind of vocational education and training bit of the system, there have been 7 more acts, 15 government commission reviews, and at least 14 new strategies.
Yeah. So give us a few more of those examples, right? Because I think for the listeners here to, you hear this more often, but I think a great asset of this report is that you go through a whole couple of cases regionally in England to really describe how this fragmentation and lack of coordination is playing out. There's a study around the Northwest, about sort of the Northeast, about the Midlands. You don't have the Southwest, but it's not just an issue about the North, it's equally an issue about the South as well. Examples of, how does this fragmentation and lack of coordination work out in practice?
Well, firstly, I should credit my co-authors because they did a lot of work on this particular part of the report. Marianne Sensier and Nicola Pike, who helped me a great deal, and we kind of put together, if you like, the analysis of how things work, or how they fit together, or how they don't fit together in each of those regions that we looked at. And one of the case studies we look at in the report is the experience of LEPs. And how LEPs fit together or don't fit together with other patterns of government in the regions. So combined authorities with mayors, but also local authorities, and that set of arrangements is likely to be thrown up in the air again in the Levelling Up White Paper. LEPs may not continue in the current form. They may be new devolution deals with counties as opposed to combined authorities, and so we may end up with more of a patchwork of little silos dotted across those regions to match the bigger silos that Whitehall oversees. And actually, if you're a business or an organisation working in that, it's very hard to know who to speak to, where to join up things for yourself in the business that you run, or the kind of product or service that you're responsible for. So if you look, for example, at the Northeast, as you know, we have a series of productivity forums, and kind of they look in detail at some of these things, and we've talked to them in the process of the report. And what you see in the Northeast is a kind of a big region that is relatively easy to get your head around economically. It's centred on kind of Newcastle as the kind of the heart of it. But you've got 2 combined authorities at either end. You've got one of them is called North of Tyne, which is an interesting name for a place. And then you've got the kind of Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin, who gets a lot of headlines. In between, you've got a bunch of authorities that didn't choose to be part of either combined authority, and they have less power as a consequence. But in the levelling up plans, it might be that they end up with county deals. So somewhere like County Durham might sit with its own deal in between these 2 combined authorities. But then you go to the geographical boundaries that the kind of LEPs run in, and they're completely different. So they'll include all or some of those different authorities.
So the geographical boundaries of the different institutions are a big mishmash, aren't they?
A real mishmash, and so it kind of begs the question: if you're going to level up the Northeast, how are you going to get these fragmented organisations being asked to do different things, to talk to each other, so that they're more than the sum of their parts rather than less?
So what is there's always a discussion about what is the optimal level. Yes, we want to decentralize powers. We want also to decentralize fiscal authorities and so on. But at some point you go too granular and there's too less firepower to do this. So how do you define and how do you find out what the right level of devolution is to get all these different types of parts of institutions work together?
So, this is a tough question, and I would imagine this is one of the toughest things that the government is wrestling with. And I think the truth is that you might come up with different answers if you're thinking about how the economy works, or if you're thinking about how local identity and kind of voting work. The government, if you like, has to work out where it makes the trade-offs between those two. What's most important to them? Is it the kind of local identity that might come up at a town or a county level, or is it that kind of spatial organisation at scale, like a city region across the whole of the northeast, that might make some sense if you're a business operating in those in that environment. And that is, you know, where they land will be interesting, because if they land closer to the kind of political end of that spectrum, we're more likely to have a kind of patchwork that doesn't work as well economically. If they land close to the economic end of that spectrum, you know, the politics might not stack up. Yeah. And of course, you know, famously under New Labour, there was a kind of, you know, a Northeast Regional Development Agency. There was very nearly a Northeast Assembly, but it was at too big a spectrum.
Rather positive amongst all things that these combined authorities may actually think about these kind of issues in terms of leveling up. So what is the benefit there? And also, how can you then transpose that combined authority concept to areas where there is no major metropole in place?
Well, I think the first thing to say about mayoral combined authorities is that they're still new. Yeah. You know, the first mayors were only elected in 2017. The first wave are now only entering their second term in office. So, you know, for the English model, this is still an experiment. Yeah. It's a limited experiment. I mean, sometimes the narrative about devolutions somewhat exceeds the reality on the ground. But as far as I can see, it works. It is beginning to, you know, these organisations, these institutions are beginning to build capacity and legitimacy. And I think in places like Greater Manchester, that's been a little bit easier, because some of those issues I described in the Northeast don't quite apply. So almost everything that happens in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority is on the same spatial level, the 10 local authorities. So whether it's kind of, you know, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or the LEP, you know, they function on that same footprint. And that means you can talk to people about the same things most of the time. Right. And that's really helpful, but that doesn't exist in other places. Nonetheless, I think it's important that in those places where it's a problem, you know, this is something that government could address. Because city regions and mayors, you know, they're developing capacity, they're developing expertise, but they're also functioning at a scale that works and can deliver some of those kind of big productivity changes in the kind of city regional markets that they operate in. There are lots of challenges there, of course, and you know, that's in the context of, as we've said, massive regional inequality. So you know, you're asking them to develop a lot over a long period of time to really make a difference. But it seems to me that it's a space economically and kind of works politically.
So just coincidentally, Martin Wolf this morning in the Financial Times had an interesting column, which was actually talking about the issue of leveling up. And he actually took the case of the Basque country in northern Spain and south part of
this is described as a country, as a nation. Yeah. You know, people have a feeling about that in a way that kind of, you know, might compare to places like the Northeast or the West Midlands, but it is a little bit different, and it has a special status within Spain. You know, it has a high degree of autonomy that very, very kind of, you know, it outstrips the kind of levels of autonomy that city regions in England have, and it really is probably closer to the kind of Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Ireland models, if you like. But it does show that you can reconcile those two things. Yeah. But I think kind of to sort of cut to the chase on what those lessons are for Oh, not very much.
Yeah.
Well, I think stability is the first, which is kind of, you know, whatever the arrangements are, and having spent time in government, there's always one last push, and we'll get the arrangements right, and it's for the next administration to leave things intact, not this one. And of course, what that means is they just have a sequence of governments kind of chopping and changing things. But trying to seek some long-term stability for the devolution arrangements and the institutions that you create, I think is really important. And you know, and that's got to stretch beyond kind of single parliaments. And really, it's got to have some degree of political consensus locally and nationally for that to happen. Now, I know that's tough, but it's really important. Yeah. I think the other thing we recommend, which is as important, is some kind of consistency of geography. It's okay to create a kind of thousand flowers blooming model where counties, towns, city regions, or kind of new constructs that are kind of half city regions might function, but you know, really you need to give people a better chance of working together. Yeah. And so where possible, I think it's very, very hard to you know, to deliver some of the kind of, you know, some of the big things that we think will matter in levelling up, like skills or R&D, if a different bit of government is working to a different spatial kind of boundary and trying to hit different objectives. So I think consistency in geography helps. That's not to say that local identity doesn't matter, or that trying to build civic pride in kind of places isn't important. But you just have to get the right balance, I think. So, you know, those are two of our big recommendations.
Yeah, and of course you need to build on something, right? I think you have a beautiful quote in the paper by Diane Coyle, also part of the Productivity Institute, and she makes this quote where she said, "Simply or Silicon Valley is useless." And we would all agree to that, of course. But on the other hand, that does show that there needs to be a level of aspiration. You need to build on something that you're strong at and continue to do that. So how do you get into that sort of kind of thinking mode?
Well, I think first you acknowledge that it's helpful to have a long-term strategy and to kind of stick to it. I mean, in the case of everyone wanting to be like Silicon Valley, as you say, that's not necessarily the right one, but whatever it is, you know, construct it and stick to it. with long-term funding, with some long-term autonomy.
Well, you mentioned funding, right? Because I think one of the issues, again, just an example, is that what we see is that for them it's hard, FE colleges, it's hard to build the capability simply because there's just no resources to make these kind of long-term investments.
Yeah, and for many years, FE has been a kind of poor relation to other parts of the education system in the kind of levels of funding that it's had. So I think that has to change too. And I worked in FE for many years and worked in FE policy for many years. So I recognise I haven't always got this right, but I think I think joining them up, giving them more flexibility and autonomy to react and to be a strategic player, a strategic institution in their places, I think is critical. But it is an area, there's a white paper, unsurprisingly, given what I've said, that kind of resets the way that colleges work with their local areas, and it introduces a whole new set of institutions. So they are all now busy thinking about how they're going to create local skills improvement plans, and not how they work with the LEP or the combined authority, but how they work with chambers of commerce. Now, that's a model that works quite well in Germany, but it's another set of institutions, in some cases working on another set of physical boundaries that are kind of thrown into that mix. And it's like, instead of kind of almost setting colleges free to deliver against all of these agendas, we're putting
people, but also the key people devising the white paper that will come up very soon will have some benefit from this. Thank you for contributing to this and joining us here today in Manchester.